Thank you all for being here. Welcome to our Salt and Light gathering tonight for young professionals, titled Faith, Hope, and Courage in a Time of Fear. Our Salt and Light gatherings are our flagship program for outreach to young professionals in DC who are interested in the intersection of faith and public life. So we're really excited to have you here. And kind of a foremost message tonight, we really encourage you, if you enjoyed the event, also tell your peers, friends, coworkers who are also interested in discussing these issues. So in this exciting time of Pope Francis, and also very concerning time in terms of extreme polarization, we've seen in our initiative a renewed interest in how Catholic social thought can offer a really solid framework and build bridges between different political ideologies, people coming from different backgrounds, whether a faith background or not. And we hope that you'll come to see your faith as an asset in your work, whether that's in your community life and community work, whether it's on the Hill in public advocacy, or just in your job here in DC. So we hope that you'll take that away with you. We're very excited to have three outstanding panelists with us tonight for a tremendously timely and important conversation. Just a quick note that you can join in our conversation on Twitter. Our hashtag is @GUCST Public Life. That was made before I got here, so don't blame me for that one. And our hashtag is #Salt and Light. So we really encourage you to engage in the conversation. I'll be over here. You'll see me tweeting away as well and sending out live tweets. So a great way to get involved. And before I introduce our initiative director, John Carr, and our evening's moderator, I'd just like to lead us in a very brief prayer to set the tone for the evening. We particularly ask that you keep our colleague, Angela Miller-McGraw, and her family in your prayers. Angela was going to be moderating this evening, but she's with her family. Her father's very ill, and we ask that you please keep her in your prayers, particularly tonight. We pray, Lord, we know that wherever two or more are gathered in your name, that you are with us. We ask you to bless and guide our discussion tonight so that we more deeply come to know you, to understand how you're calling us to love and to serve others in need in public life, especially the marginalized and voiceless, and to build a deeper spirit of respect, partnership, and love between Catholics and Muslims in this country and beyond. We are especially heartened by Pope Francis's serious commitment to interreligious dialogue and cooperation, and ask that you may continue to guide him in this task. We also pray for those who are killed in an act of hate in Orlando and their families, for those whom are subject to unjust fear as a result, particularly the LGBT community and the American Muslim community. We ask this in your name. Amen. Now, just very briefly introduce John Carr, our initiative director. John directs our initiative here at Georgetown University and is also the Washington correspondent of America magazine. I highly encourage you to check out his columns that are regularly published in America magazine. And after a long career of public service with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Archdiocese of Washington, and the White House Conference on Families, John held a residential fellowship at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University in 2012 and 2013 before founding the initiative here. So I'll turn it over to him to introduce our panelists.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I'm the reason he missed his cube, and I felt terrible about that before he threw our Twitter handle under the bus. Yeah, I'll report back. We're really glad you're here. It's a beautiful evening. This is a tough topic. It's been a very tough year. A week ago, in a day, we had the terrible attack in Orlando at the Pulse. 49 people gone, many more injured, families crushed, city in mourning. Just a year ago, yesterday I believe, we had the attack at Mother Emanuel Church, AME Church in Charleston. People at Bible study murdered. And again, violence. In this case, violence responded to by forgiveness, an amazing witness, the role of faith. In between, we've had Paris, we've had San Bernardino, we've had Brussels. And the rituals are too familiar. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. The vigils, now the funerals. And in some ways, they bring great comfort. They're signs of solidarity. The rhetoric, frankly, at least for me, is less comforting. It usually takes less than 24 hours before we start fighting, at least in the political arena. Somehow these terrible events bring out the worst in us. When you put together terror and fear, politics and guns, hate, and in this case, sexuality, we get old talking points and prejudices instead of new actions to comfort those who mourn, to build bridges of solidarity and replace hate with love. It's particularly important, I think, for the people here, for our initiative for Georgetown, that people of faith and religious leaders provide some life-giving alternatives to the rhetoric and business as usual. We have to find a way to move beyond grief and anger to new ways of confronting not only our sadness, sometimes our fears, but also, in the words of the title of our session, to offer hope and courage. Pope Francis, for me, has been a beacon in difficult times because he is a symbol of solidarity. He resists all kinds of violence. He brings hope to a suffering world. I was privileged to be in the House chamber when he gave his presentation. And it was a stunning event. This little figure in white, at least where I was, he looked little, in a place that I've experienced in lots of ways, and it's full of noise and combat. And for a moment, it was quiet. And in the middle of his speech, he said, "Our world is increasingly a place of violent conflict, hatred, and brutal atrocities, committed even in the name of God and of religion. We must be attentive to every form of fundamentalism," he said, "whether it's religious or some other kind. We must especially guard against the simplistic reductionism which sees only good or evil, or if you will, the righteous and the sinners." These are his words. "We need to confront every form of polarization which would divide us into these two camps. We know that in the attempt to be freed of the enemy without, we can be tempted to feed the enemy within, to imitate the hatred and violence of tyrants and murderers." He said, "We have to offer a message of hope and healing, of peace and justice. Our effort must be aimed at restoring hope, righting wrongs, maintaining commitments, and thus promoting the well-being of individuals and peoples. We need a new spirit of fraternity and solidarity, cooperating generously for the common good." That's a powerful vision. It's hard to imagine how we might go that direction, but we have three people tonight who can help us think about what we are experiencing, what we are facing, and how we might get to somewhere else. So we want to look at what we've been experiencing through the eyes of faith, yes, hope, yes, courage, yes. What are moral, ethical criteria for responding to these challenges? How does faith help us look at this in a different way? In what ways is religion the problem, or in what ways is religion the answer? And how do we build bridges across lines, race, ethnicity, faith, and identity? So we have three remarkable leaders on the front lines of this effort. Dr. Maryann Cusimano Love has been at this work for a long time, even though she looks like she began it as a child. She's an associate professor of international relations in the Department of Politics at Catholic University. She went to Johns Hopkins, the University of Texas, and St. Joseph's University. She helps the State Department, the Pentagon, the Conference of Catholic Bishops. She worked with the International Commission on Religious Freedom. She has written powerful books, Beyond Sovereignty, Morality Matters. My favorite little piece she wrote was 5 Myths About Pope Francis in the Post. She is part of the Catholic Peace Building Network and the Board of Jesuit Relief Services. We all ought to be jealous of Maryann. She lives on the Chesapeake Bay, and she left there to be with us tonight, so we're very grateful, with her husband and her 3 young children. So Maryann we're delighted she's here. And also, with another important perspective, is Dr. Hedieh Mirahmadi. Told her I would get it wrong. She is a really respected expert on intergroup relations, on resisting extremism. She is the president of the World Organization for Resource Development and Education. Great acronym, WORD. She has another great acronym. She promotes social cohesion and builds resilience against extremism through a group called BRAVE. You have a gift for this. Building resilience against violent extremism. She has established an international cultural center. She's a California girl. She graduated from the University of Southern California. And she has done a lot of work in 2 of the most dangerous, conflicted places on earth, Pakistan and Afghanistan. She's also contributed to books Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in an Age of Religious Conflict, Islam and Civil Society, and The Other Muslims, Moderate and Secular. Thank you for joining us. And Jordan Denari, Duffner, is from Georgetown. She is deeply involved in Muslim-Christian dialogue, serving as a Catholic voice in those dialogues, resisting Islamophobia. She works for a remarkable group at Georgetown called the Bridge Initiative. It's a research project in our Center for Christian Muslim Understanding. She writes and speaks. She's been in Time Magazine, The Post, America, National Catholic Reporter, Commonweal. I especially like your work for America. It's a wonderful magazine, you know. And she's writing a book for the Liturgical Press on Muslim Catholic dialogue and solidarity. Grew up in the Midwest in Indianapolis. And for a group of young people, she's a great example in that she came out of school and got a wonderful job doing what she believes in. So it's a goal we all share. I'm going to ask a couple questions of the whole group and then ask each of them to sort of focus a little bit. I would remind you that we have this terrible Twitter, at GUCST Public Life, hashtag Salt and Light. Let me start with the title, Faith, Hope, and Courage in a Time of Fear. What should we legitimately be afraid of? What should we be angry about in the face of all this? My wife ran a nursery school in our neighborhood, just retired. For years, they took the kids down to the Smithsonian on the Metro. Now, there are 2 reasons why they probably don't take the Metro. One, it wouldn't get them there. But secondly, their parents were afraid. What might happen? Someone would do something terrible. But so how are we right to be a little afraid and pretty angry? On the other hand, how does fear and anger get used or abused or manipulated and actually do harm to the causes we agree on? Why don't I start with Maryann? So what can and should we be afraid of, and how does fear and anger get in the way?
One of my favorite verses from Scripture that I think is really apropos in a time of terror is the verse from Timothy. The Lord has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. The problem is right now that there are groups, violent extremist groups, but also political leaders in the United States and around the world, nationalist, fascist, political leaders, and the media, and their business model is to peddle fear and anger. That's the business model. That's the success for politics, whether you're ISIS or Donald Trump. That is the successful model for selling more units of your media empire. And that is the model that a lot of folks are out there peddling. I think our faith groups are a real antidote to that, because faith is not only antithetical to fear and anger, but our faith tells us that our reason, our gift of reason, can help us to navigate these shores. And when you actually unpack the data, you see how inflated the fear is, okay? And particularly here in the United States. I mean, acts of terrorism are on the decline. You would not know that from reading the newspaper or listening to our media broadcasts. There were 62 terror attacks in 1995. There were 19 in 2014. You are more likely to die by being electrocuted in your bathtub than you are to die from an act of terrorism in the United States. I mean, it's not going to happen. You're much more likely to die from a lightning strike. Okay, so in the United States, are you likely to die from an act of terrorism? No, not at all. Okay, is it possible to die in gun violence? Yes, sirree, it is. Okay, you are 25 times more likely to die in gun violence in the United States than in any other wealthy or developed country. So we do have a real problem with guns and gun violence. Do we have a problem with terrorism here? No, not so much. Now, does that mean terrorism isn't a problem in other places? It absolutely is a problem in other places, in war zones. And we can talk more about the context of war and peace. But peace is breaking out around the world. That's the good news. It's not good news if you're in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, where there's very, very heavy conflict. And that's where terrorism is most concentrated. That's where the terrorist attacks are most severe, where the casualties are most severe. And so folks living in those bad neighborhoods, in those civil war zones, they have a lot to be concerned about. Here, the threat perception is much different. The threat reality is much different.
I'm sure people felt that, but if you went to Latin night in Orlando at Pulse, that was terror, looks like. If you were at that office gathering in San Bernardino, so the numbers aren't great, but the reality is there. Hedieh, you have spent a lifetime dealing with these matters and do so within the Muslim community as a force for reconciliation, for understanding. What, as you watch what's happened over the last year, what should we be afraid of, and what should we worry about in terms of fear being misused and manipulated for political purposes or for other purposes? You've been in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Maryann says the threat is much greater. But we feel the threat. You deal with the threat. How should we think about our fear and our anger? When is it right and when is it wrong and misused?
It's a really difficult question, to tell you the truth, because I sit here and I'm grappling with how do I convey a objective truth to you without fear mongering, So bear with me. I'm going to try to do that. But I think the thing with terrorism is it's a low volume, high impact threat. In other words, a single terrorist attack tears at the fabric of our communities. In other words, it's not just how many people die at a site, even though this last attack was the second largest since 9/11, but it reverberates throughout our communities and our society. So that fear lives way beyond that event. And so I think it is something that we need to be concerned about. And it's definitely not the only threat we face in this country, but it is real. And it's real for a variety of reasons. There are people there was over 253 some recruits convicted of ISIS-related plots in 2015 alone. There are 40,000 active ISIS recruiters. There's 1,000 open cases in all 50 states of the United States. So it's not It's not a huge volume, but again, the impact of what they're capable of tears at our society. And so that's what we need to come to grips with. And how do we do that without the demise of rational thought? In other words, how do we do it as responsible, level-headed, compassionate, loving citizens, as stewards of our earth, without allowing it to consume us as individuals? And so I mean, what we are doing in our program is, in particular, is bringing back that sense of community, having people come together, not just for dialogue, which is important, but taking a responsibility for public safety. So, in other words, intervening in the lives of vulnerable individuals. I mean, and look at Omar Mateen. He had so many emotional problems and other disturbances that you look at his life and what we see in the papers and say, wow, how many intervention points were there in this man's life that somebody should have done something way before the police? And not just should we keep FBI investigations open longer, that's not what we want. We want to say, what could we as a society have done better? And so I think that's what I'm hoping is going to eventually happen with the fear and the anger. My greatest fear is that we'll lose the ability to think about this rationally.
Very helpful. Jordan, you're in the business of building bridges. In some ways, it's more important than ever, and in other ways, it must be getting harder in some ways. How do you think about what we've been through in the last week, in the last year?
Well, it's funny you mention it getting a little bit harder, because about an hour before I was supposed to go give a talk on Islamophobia at a Unitarian Universalist church on Sunday, I heard about the attack in Orlando. And I thought, this is going to make my task a little bit more difficult, because many Americans may be coming to this thinking, why are we talking about Islamophobia when a Muslim has just done this? But I actually, my view was that this conversation is incredibly important, and is still maybe even more important than it was before the attack, because we can't let one act of violence or intolerance breed more. And so for me, you were asking about anger and fear and what's legitimate and what's not. And for me, some of my fears and anger come from that exploitation of unfortunate situations, and how we allow it to transform into Islamophobia, to anti-Muslim prejudice and discrimination. And I'm really concerned about the kinds of things that Trump gets away with saying, and the fact that there's so many of his base and so many people in the American public that support the positions that he's been putting forth, not just since December, but even yesterday. I think he said that profiling Muslims is common sense. And there's unfortunately more support for that in our public than is comfortable for us to accept. And so yeah, I've been concerned not just with what occurred, but what happens as a result, because of the fear of Muslims and people's reactions to terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about politics. Trump is sort of a dominant voice on this. He has ridden some of these issues to the nomination, but he's not alone. I mean, you watch the responses. Somebody did a word cloud of the responses, and our two different parties were talking about two different realities of what happened last weekend. So almost immediately we get the polarization that's infected our politics. I was really struck when I was scrambling because Angela wasn't going to be here. What Pope Francis said, he said, we got to resist fundamentalism and we got to fight polarization. And some of this is really deep, and some of it is just obvious. I mean, we just look at the world through our own narrow views, whether it's politics or prejudice or religion or in some other places, race. How would you assess, Maryann, you watch this stuff all the time, the politics of this, and how people, you can't talk people out of their genuine emotions. So how do we effectively help people deal with what they're seeing and what they think?
I think a couple of things. First, to realize this is not a U.S. phenomenon. We're seeing it through the U.S. eyes and through the eyes of a presidential election year. But this type of political polarization we're seeing around the world right now. And in a period of great change, a period of rapid globalization, people kind of return to their nativist roots. And so around the world, you're seeing a politics that is very polarized with both extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing parties, and often moving very quickly from one to the other. So this type of narrative is not restricted to the United States, so context matters. How do you combat it? You combat it with relationships. The more that there is, this is why the work that the other two folks here on the panel are doing is so important. It's really easy to be at ease with the group you came in with and to demonize the group you know the least about. And the more you know, the more contact there is, the harder it is to sustain those global narratives. And the third, I think, is with information and understanding and context. You know, the whole narrative about Islamic violence and Muslim fundamentalism right now, you really have to understand the demographics of conflict. So terrorism is most severe in war zones. That's where there's the most terrorist attacks, or where there's the most terrorist casualties. Okay? When the war zones were Ireland, the terrorists were Christians. When the war zones were Colombia, the terrorists were Christians. When the war zone was Sri Lanka, the terrorists, the Tamil Tigers, were Hindus. Now, the good news is, and again, you wouldn't know this from the headlines, that peace is breaking out around the world today. Let me say that again, because you probably don't believe me. We have more people on the planet than ever before, 7 billion people, and we've had a huge reduction in violence and war. So 25 years ago, end of the Cold War, 34 major wars. Okay? Now, even with the violence in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan since the Arab Spring, we have 10. The number of casualties in those wars, radically, radically down. 20th century, bloodiest century in human history. Millions, 40 million dead in World War I, 60 million dead in World War II. Now, under 100,000, and that's with the uptick in the war in Syria. So the number of casualties down, okay? The number of wars down, okay? And the number of terrorist attacks are in those war zones. So where are the world's major war zones right now? They're in majority Muslim countries. So of course the terrorists are Muslims. So are the security forces and the police forces fighting the terrorists. And so are the victims of terrorism. Okay? These are 99% Muslim majority countries. Of course, the people involved in those civil wars are Muslim. That doesn't mean that this is something unique to the religion. This is about the demographics of the conflict. The solution here is to build peace in those war zones. And those wars will eventually end. Okay? And when they do, so will that problem of terrorism of those groups.
You talked about reason and reality, and you've been in these war zones. You've done a lot of work in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As you watch the debate, as an American citizen, as a Muslim, somebody who resists extremism, what do you make of this?
I have been doing this a long time. So I've been doing it for 20 years. And this may be shocking, but what Trump says, I'm not as it's very disturbing that Trump has the platform to say what he's saying, but what concerns me more is the people that are listening to it. Like how many Americans are convinced by it. And to me, unfortunately, I feel like it's slightly a reflection of the inability to address the issue again in a way that is rational. So in other words, I feel, and this is from my running a clinical program, my clinicians are telling me is that like it's the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness leads people to aggression. We've removed people's agency, their ability to affect change. So Trump represents change. He represents giving people their power back. So that's why for us, we're like, okay, well, how do we return people's agency? Then you have to empower people to intervene, to get educated, to meet their neighbors, to affect change through social action. We have to mobilize people and believe they can make a difference, that they can impact this situation. And if I might add also about religion, there has been a concerted effort by a small band of extremists to manipulate the religion. They are using deviant interpretations of the faith to use violence to bring about social change. So that is happening, and the thing is what the reason it's changed from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, the reason why the threat has increased is because of their ability to manipulate social media. So in the old days, Al-Qaeda, the recruit would have to find Al-Qaeda, would search Al-Qaeda out. It was almost this like elitist club. But with ISIS, they're seeking the recruit out. So they basically are looking for public profiles of the mentally ill, the disenfranchised, the socially alienated, and saying, hey, come, we're going to give you a place in a sense of belonging. And so your people and communities are up, and families are up against this predator that's trying to reach into their house and pull their kid out or pull their vulnerable individual out. So what do we do as communities to prevent that from happening? You know, you got to embrace the community. The first line of defense has to be the home. Second line of defense has to be the friend's home, and so on and so forth. And that requires a societal shift. That requires us to go back to the drawing board and be like, you know what, we all have a responsibility to do this better.
You do a lot of work in Montgomery County.
Yes.
In this area. I think the White House has recognized what Montgomery County is doing as a model. How do you take these ideas? You describe the isolated individual who has an enormous sense of powerlessness, who is sought out and recruited and encouraged to act. And you talked about home and community. What are you doing in Montgomery County? What are some of the lessons that we should learn?
So what we did is, besides we've been researchers on violent extremism and terrorism around the world and building community resilience tactics for over a decade now. So we took all of that knowledge and Muslim community engagement activities around the world with law enforcement and try to note what was going well and what was going wrong. Then we took social integration theory, which was developed in the late 60s for...
Repeat that again.
Social integration theory in the United States. Decades of research after the civil rights movement. How do we bring communities together? We took positive social integration theory and we applied it in the Muslim community context. So we said, basically, there's 6 principles that you have to follow. You bring people in as equals. They work towards a mutual goal. They work towards accomplishing that goal. And by virtue of meeting people different than themselves and working towards a mutual goal, they develop respect and understanding. We applied those principles and it worked. So the idea is you basically are connecting people, educating them and moving them towards the common goal. And the common goal is public safety and social cohesion. So what kind of activities can we do? Internet safety seminars, understanding the risk factors of radicalization, everything from white supremacy, school shooters, all the way over to jihadist groups. So making sure we always cover the spectrum when we talk about radicalization. But also, how do you treat the mentally ill? How do you protect houses of worship? All of these collaborative efforts between Muslim and non-Muslim communities, so we're building a series of community relationships and also the ability to intervene if they recognize that somebody's vulnerable and being able to refer them to resources way before law enforcement.
It strikes me that the Catholic community knows something about integration. No Irish Need Apply was not just in the movies,
right.
and people thought the Irish were the greatest threat to civilization. Some still believe that, but you work within both the Christian community
Yes,
and
absolutely.
the Muslim community, Jordan. How do you, what we're talking about here is the reality that it's modest in its threat, but huge in its impact. And that impacts how we see each other. How do you build community in the middle of all this?
Well, I want to give some pretty concrete examples specifically for Catholics, because I know that's who we have here. And I think what Maryann and Hedieh have mentioned about relationship building is hugely important. And I think in this current moment, we have some great opportunities for that, especially for Catholics and Muslims, because we are not only in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, the holy month of fasting for Muslims, but we're also in the middle of the Year of Mercy. And I don't know if many people are aware, but mercy is a great place for Muslims and Christians, particularly Catholics, to start conversations, because Pope Francis has made mercy the motto of his papacy, and in many ways, mercy is the motto of Islam. So if you're even looking for a topic to start a conversation, my recommendation is to start there. And I have a lot of sort of concrete thoughts about what young Catholics and people here in DC can do.
Sure.
Okay, great. This is a good time. Let me just look at my list here. So one thing that people can do is host an iftar meal, which is the fast breaking meal at the end of the day during the month of fasting. I have just been at some great ones just this month, hosted by Shoulder to Shoulder, which is a really wonderful coalition of non-Muslim faith groups that are standing in solidarity with the Muslim community in light of Islamophobia. And so they have done some great interfaith meals that have allowed people to learn not just about their similarities, but to learn what fasting is like and to learn more about Islam. Like I said, the Year of Mercy is a great time to talk about this similarity, and we still have about 5 months left in the Year of Mercy, so you still have plenty of time to schedule events. It's funny, I was on Twitter today, and I came across something that came out of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, and it was a recommendation for how Catholics can dialogue about mercy with members of different faith groups. And I thought, why didn't this get spread around sooner? Because we're already halfway through the year, but it's there, and
7 months late is pretty good for the Vatican.
Yeah, I guess so.
We're ahead of the curve.
I guess so. Yeah, and one of the things that I also would recommend is that we pray for Muslims at Mass. We pray all the time for. In the petitions or the prayers of the faithful, we pray for victims of terrorism, and usually that. Or persecuted Christians, but we don't ever pray for Muslims experiencing violence, refugees, or just our Muslim neighbors, especially in this holy month of fasting, and people facing the hostility and the Islamophobia that unfortunately is here in this country. So those are some of my concrete recommendations for young Catholics today.
Great. I know Maryann from her work with the Bishops' International Justice and Peace Committee. One thing that strikes me is we'd all be a lot better off if our leaders had taken the advice of Pope John Paul II and the Catholic bishops and not invaded Iraq. I was actually with the papal nuncio to the president, and he brought in a letter from John Paul II and said, if you do this, here are the things which will happen, and talked about essentially the destruction of Iraq, great threats to Muslim-Christian relationships, the radicalization of people, the spread of violence, all of which, if only they had listened. So they should have listened to you then. What is there within our tradition? We've been thinking about this for hundreds of years. What are the principles that we should think about in terms of the use of force, response to violence, how you build community? We have a different way of looking at the world. Share with us those ideas.
I was just in Iraq this spring, and it is heartbreaking because it was exactly what was predicted would occur. And we do have blood on our hands here in this country, and I don't think there's any self-reflection about that, about the role that we caused in destroying this country and destabilizing the region. Not that it was perfect before we got there. There were a lot of fault lines, there was a lot of violence, but we were too willing to excuse ourselves from the current situation. There's a couple of things in terms of both practical demographics and principles. Practical demographics. The Catholic faith demographically and the Christian faith demographically is the only one that's spread in every continent. So if you look at the other major faiths, Hinduism, Buddhism, large faith traditions never left the cradle, never left their countries of origin. Islam is still 2/3 in Asia, still close to its countries of origin. Christianity, for a variety of reasons, blame the peripatetic apostles, blame missionaries, what have you, but they moved across, the world. And so right now you've seen in the last century, Christianity go from a century ago when it was 70% in northern countries to now almost 70%, 67% in the global south. Well, what does that mean? It means that Christians are in the countries of violence today and the countries of poverty and can play those roles of bridge builders because we have these practical networks. And what do our networks do? Well, they serve all based on need, not creed. So, the sisters in Iraq and in Damascus are not only serving Christians and saying, well, I'm sorry, you're Muslim. There's no emergency food assistance for you here. That's not how it works. Okay? And so that message of serving all and that practical function of serving all is a real plus for the ability to build bridges across these war-torn communities. So that's the practical side. We have these networks. We have them in places of great need, and the networks are working to build bridges. On the principled side, we have these ideas about reconciliation, forgiveness, the fundamental value of all human life. All human life. Some of our Christian colleagues don't have that. They have apocalyptic visions in which they believe and actually want to nurture violence between Christians and Muslims. I think this will usher in the end times, and they think peace building between Islam and Christianity is getting in the way of God's plan. We don't follow that view. We do not follow that view. So I think Pope Francis has been very, very helpful in serving to highlight that, the need to build peace, the practical opportunities to build peace, the ways in which our communities come together in these regions of need. And so we have both, I think, the principles and the practical means to do so. And it gives me hope when I visit war zones and see what our faith leaders are doing at the front lines of violence. And they do not feel helpless and hopeless. And they are working to build and even lay the seeds for reconciliation in places that you would think, gosh, that's not possible. It's not possible to have reconciliation in Iraq today. Well, who am I to say that when these sisters think it is? And when they are trying to set the patterns in the way they provide social services right now to set the table for reconciliation. All wars end. Whether they end well or whether they end badly depends on us, depends on what we do. And I think we have some real tools, some principles, and some practical assets we can bring to the table of peace building around the world.
You talked about the family as people reaching into the family. What must it be like these days to be Muslim parents, and particularly of young men, and to sort of see the way they're shown on television, to see the way that extremists are after them? How help us? We are not Muslim. Most of the people here are too young to be parents. I'm sure I'll find somebody at the cocktail party. What goes on help us do a little missionary work. What goes on in Muslim families when all this is surrounding them and you've got a house full of young people?
So it could be quite a challenge. So first of all, most families, both parents are working. Mm-hmm. So nobody's home when the kids come home from school, or they're just they're on shifts where the mother's coming or going, and sometimes it's the mother, sometimes it's the father, so the kids, like all the other kids, are spending way too much time on the internet if somebody doesn't catch them, and besides that, a lot of them are immigrants. And the countries, the tradition they came from, they were I don't want to belittle it, but it was they were culturally Muslim, meaning it was part of their identity. They were in an almost homogeneous society.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have to stay on top of your child's religion. So it was kind of we're Muslims, of course, and this is what we do. We fast, we pray, you know what I mean? We spend the holidays. They didn't have to work at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so now parents are like, oh, no, my kid is Muslim. What am I going to do? How am I going to teach him? Okay, drop him at the Sunday school. So you drop them at the Sunday school, and you have no idea who's teaching them at the Sunday school. There's part-time people. It's not a structured program. These are all kind of makeshift, a lot of times, like kind of makeshift programs. And so the child may come back with an idea that's a little bit off, and the parent's like, whoa, where'd that come from? Where'd you get that from? And
you have CCD too.
Is it a similar concept?
That's what ours is.
And so juxtapose that with some children coming home every day, if not once, twice a week, but getting called Bin Laden, towel head, terrorist. And so the child is wanting to gravitate either towards throwing off Islam or cloaking themselves in Islam. And as a parent, you're trying to mediate this to the extremes. It was trying to avoid the fundamentalism and telling your child, no, there's a balance, there's a middle way. You're American and you're Muslim, and there's no incompatibility between these two things. And I mean, it becomes a very difficult challenge. Besides all of the other stuff that, that childhood and puberty and sexuality and all the other things that every other family deals with and every other child deals with.
Oh, there's no problem with that stuff. Easy. I'm going to come to Jordan in a minute, but one of the things you may not know about Maryann is she is a best-selling children's author. I frankly have read more of her children's books to my kids than I have those big, really smart things about sovereignty. My favorite is Sleep, Baby, Sleep. But seriously.
Piece of fiction.
You Are My Miracle, You Are My Wish, You Are My Wonders. These are stunningly good books. Christmas presents for your nieces and nephews, it's the greatest takeaway from this program tonight. But your kids are now getting older. How do you talk to them about this? They can't escape what happened last weekend. They can't escape what happened in that church.
Yeah.
It's probably some ways different, but in other ways not so. How do you talk to your kids about this stuff?
Truthfully, contextually, so you can't, hide it and pretend it didn't happen, So we talk about when the violence happens, when the mass killings happen. But then we try to reassure them of their safety, because it's probably not going to happen here on this street at this day, And then we try to talk about why it happens. Some of the things that you were mentioning. This was a troubled person. This was somebody who was socially disconnected. These are the reasons we need to reach out more, not less. These are people who are trying to create fear. And then they pick up. I mean, they pick up on the Washington Post Pinocchio's award. They're very big on truth and lies, And they say, did you hear what Donald Trump said today? How can he get away with that?
Seriously. Your 8-year-old is keeping track of Donald Trump?
They do. And we don't have the
CNN
television
doesn't
news
keep
on.
track of
We don't have the
Donald
television
Trump.
news on. And they ask me, is that true? So we talk about telling truth and telling lies. And the problem of telling lies to get elected, or the problem of telling lies to sell product. When we talk about that in the context of advertising, I'm trying to help them deconstruct the advertising world that they are enveloped in. But we talk about that in terms of citizenship. They're just trying to get you to vote for them. They're just trying to get you to buy that product. Do you think that's true? So trying to help them develop the tools they'll need as citizens. Because I'm not going to be there to drive this ship. That's up to them, and trying to give them tools of resilience and self abilities to do that.
Jordan, you work in 2 communities, and with different histories, but a lot in common. I always think that when Catholics talk to Muslims, we have to have a certain modesty, in that we discovered religious freedom in 1965 at the Second Vatican Council. For those younger, it's a big meeting of all the bishops that said that people believe differently have dignity and rights and some element of truth. The Crusades were not a movie, you know. There's a part of us that is a part of that. And yet there is also the reality that some people are radicalized. Some people do pick up this perversion, I think you called it, of a religion. How do you not just say kumbaya? I mean, how do you talk about the reality of our faith, which is complicit in a lot of violence through the years, and the reality of another person's faith, which can be misused for violence? How do you get people to talk about building bridges based on firm ground where our faith can get misused?
Yeah, well, I think you were right to mention that in both of our religious histories, we have a lot of negative stuff. We're all, complicit more or less in negative things that have happened, not just in the past, but also today. You know, I sometimes think that the Crusades example or the KKK example don't work super well because people say, oh, well, that's a small group, or oh, that was a long time ago. But I was in Mass the other day, and it's not 4th of July, but we sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So to me, there's some sort of like Christian nationalism going on, and I think when we need to also recognize that as Americans, when we go and fight wars abroad, we're also, we're not as critical about that as we sometimes could be. So for me, yes, we both have these histories, but we also, the people in the room that I'm dialoguing with, or the friends that I'm sitting in a coffee shop with in Amman, we actually don't have any involvement in either, bombings that are happening in Syria or Iraq, or bombings that the U.S. is also dropping, in Syria or Iraq, or violence elsewhere. And I think we realize that we actually have a lot more in common than we do different. And I think it actually isn't as hard as you might think to lay some of that stuff by the wayside and say, I just want to get to know you, and I actually want to learn about your religion too. But first approach this conversation as friends.
Great. Why don't we invite others to come forward? I think we have some mics. And I would remind people they can join the conversation at GUSCST Public Life, at least for one more week. Hashtag Salt and Light. There's one back there, a hand up. Yeah. Wait for the mic.
Is it working? Yes. My name is Ashley Wilson. I work for Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. I thought the question about what do you talk to your kids about was interesting, but I want to flip it on its head because I don't have kids to talk to about this issue. What I do have are parents, right, or members of Congress who, in conversations about Islamophobia, say things to me like, oh, you'll see when you get older, you'll understand, like, this is the way the world works. This is the way that they are. And that to me, right, it's like really hard. And I don't know what to say in response, whether it's something more direct and aggressive, I think, in that way, or even conversations when I say, like, how can you be endorsing this person that is promoting a lot of hateful rhetoric in our nation? So I wonder, the advice to kids was great, but what do I say to people like my parents?
Okay. We all have parents. Jump right in here.
I think just trying to break down stereotypes with facts helps, because stereotypes don't stand the light of day. So trying to, as you said, bring people together so they have some actual people from different communities together, but also just factual information. So it's just hard to have those worldviews. They don't stand up to empirical inquiry very well. So I find that as a way to just kind of in conversation to try to break down and pierce some holes in some of those lines of inquiry.
I think one of the things too is, unfortunately, people don't understand the consequences of this sort of rhetoric. And they don't understand what Muslims are experiencing in this country in terms of Islamophobia. And I think once people start to recognize that, Muslim kids are having to deal with being bullied at school because they're Muslim, and coming home to their parents and talking about this and expressing concern over the fact that people perceive Muslims as bad people. I had a colleague tell me that they heard about one child who came home and said, "Mommy, why are we Muslim? Because I hear at school that Muslims are bad people. So why are we Muslim? We're not bad." So the psychological impact that this is having on even kids as young as 4 and 5 years old is really is distressing. Women choosing to take off their headscarf or take self-defense classes because of all of the attacks that have unfortunately occurred, being committed towards Muslim women. So I think when we realize the impact that these things have on people, you can't deny people's reality. You can't deny that these things are going on. And I think people, if they realize the negative impact, they might be more hesitant to so readily endorse profiling or banning Muslims or something like that.
What would you say to Christian young people about how they ought to talk to their parents?
I would suggest educate yourself and be honest. I educate yourself so that you understand the facts, so that you're able to articulate it clearly to your parents. In other words, don't read exaggerations. Try to find, there are some really great studies that come out of reputable universities about radicalization, about violent extremism. It's, the percentage compared to the rest of the population, what some of those case studies are, so that you can clearly articulate to a loved one, this has only been this many people. This is because they've, manipulated the religious text. This is their goal, and it's only a small segment of the community. And there are all these tools in which we could use to try to educate ourselves and to reduce the threat in the community. But I would be intellectually honest. I think by not being intellectually honest, I think that's part of the reason we are where we are at this point.
I think I'm supposed to ask questions, not answer my own, but I'm in charge. So I was really struck by the way I felt when you were talking about parents of Muslim kids. If someone called me an Islamophobic, I would get defensive and angry and prove to you that I was not or knowledgeable. When you talked about people trying to hold 2 jobs, raise kids with values, hold on to their faith. I thought about my own family and raising teenagers and stuff. So I think part of what we're saying here is building bridges, identifying with what we hold in common. The fact that people hold on to their faith because it gives them a way of looking at the world and helps them be better people, that's a plus for our country. That's a plus for our community. So do you think Islamophobia is a good word to use with people or not?
Really? I have to answer that? It's not my favorite. It definitely at this point, people have a visceral reaction to it. So I actually hear a lot of the criticisms of it. So I try to deflect using it so that we could reach people that we otherwise wouldn't reach, because it seems that people are naysayers, or the people, you don't want to be you don't want to speak to the choir, right? Everyone says, we always speak to the choir when we do interfaith events. So the idea is, how do you draw in people to enlightenment or to a more rational opinion? You have to be able to meet them where they're at. So at this point, the term does create this kind of reaction in people. So we try to say, anti-Muslim bigotry. Like if you see the Washington Post about the statistics, there's been 2 Post articles about the data and the research that we've done. They refer to it as anti-Muslim bigotry. Mm-hmm. And just kind of sometimes just using other terminology just so we could, reach people that we otherwise wouldn't be able to reach.
As the resident person who works for the Islamophobia Project, can
Yeah.
I respond?
All
That would
right.
be great. Thank
That's
you.
why. That's why I said I didn't
Yeah.
No. So a couple things. The way we define Islamophobia in our initiative is prejudice and discrimination against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslim, and we're really intentional about talking about Islamophobia as a phenomenon. We're not finger pointing, calling people Islamophobes. That's not helpful, as Hedieh said. You don't want to alienate your audience. But I think it is also helpful to have a term that we can all use to identify this. Homophobia is also not an ideal word. Neither is anti-Semitism. But we know when we use those words what they mean. They mean anti-Jewish prejudice, discrimination, anti-LGBTQ discrimination. And so I think it's one about defining the term and using it in an appropriate way. But I would also point out as well that we've actually seen the media and politicians accept the word Islamophobia a lot in recent months. And I actually did some research on that for the Bridge Initiative, looking at different outlets that have used it. New York Times, Washington Post, PBS News, I mean, you name it. And so, yes, it's not an ideal word. I wish we could come up with something that was linguistically perfect, but people are using it, and if we use it in the right manner, I think it can be beneficial for us.
One of the things that strikes me, you use the example of homophobia. It's one of the most remarkable movements of our time, and what made the difference, it seems to me, is people personalized this. They knew people who were gay or lesbian, or everybody had a favorite niece. And so one of the lessons here is less language and more connections. Other questions? There's one here and one here.
Thanks. So coming off of your point, John, about this is based off of connections and there's been a lot of success with personalization. Jordan, you mentioned you were speaking in several events and you are very kind of embedded in the network where there's a lot of people who are themselves Muslim or are interested in the faith. This is maybe a question to anyone, but how can we get plugged in to making those relationships when we don't know many people? I moved here, right? So my Muslim friends are not here. How can I kind of be a better person at making those relationships, finding those relationships without it being awkward? Like, are you Muslim? Can I talk to you? So just any tips on that or organizations?
Oh,
Thanks.
I got tons. Friend me on Facebook. I'll introduce you to 600 of them. You'll have you'll meet more Muslims than you could ever possibly have time to spend with. But seriously, I mean, I think between me and Jordan, you'd probably be able to fill your entertainment calendar for the next year.
Yeah.
I like the idea of breaking the fast.
But this is the spirit. We call it the iftar circuit.
I'm better at breaking the fast than fasting.
Well, and if you really just want to wander around DC, every Sunday night, there's iftars on the mall right now. So you can just walk up to someone and say, oh, are you Muslim? I see you're breaking your fast right now, So there are great opportunities. As I mentioned before, shoulder to shoulder. If you follow their work on social media, you can get hooked up with what they're doing. And I think Potter's House, they tend to do a really good job hosting dialogue events, things like that.
Busboy and Poets also do a lot.
Yeah, I would really recommend just looking for events on social media, and then you'll kind of start finding people and finding friends. So.
I'm relatively new to Georgetown. I'm approaching 3 years. One of the most remarkable things about the university has been that its campus ministry is so interfaith, and so there is great support for a wide variety of religious expressions, and frankly, there's no excuse for being ignorant. And I think ignorance is at the source of a lot of this. There was another hand up.
Hi, my name is Julie McStravik, I work for the Catholic bishops in the Secretariat of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs.
Wonderful outfit.
Thank you. And so as I've been doing this, one of the things I noticed tonight is we have an all-woman panel, which is not what happens often, especially in academic settings. So John, did you put this together? Good on you. And so I have a twofold question. One, I want to know if you could speak at all to your experience being a woman in such a male dominated field, and two, what women can bring to the peace building process that is unique.
Peace building.
Yeah, I think women have some real assets in peace building, both because of the ability to find common ground, relationship ground across identity communities. So the roles of women are often quite similar across identity communities: responsibilities for children and family, responsibility for meals, and those things. And those can be those avenues for being able to cross boundaries that others cannot. Also, I think our low social status can actually be used as a secret weapon, that women can move across those identity communities in ways that go off the radar, that are not seen as much. So they can be very effective. So women are the front lines of peace building around the world, and they're the emergency responders in every conflict and every crisis. The challenge is getting that recognition once it gets to more formal peace processes, and once more governmental structures get in, then the women usually get elbowed away from the peace table. But I think that that's true in informal processes as well. In families, women will be marrying across identity lines, across those lines, and so they can be these personal relationship builders. And that can be a real helpful thing. It's challenging because they're often unseen because of that low social status, both economically, politically, you name it. We think we're very advanced here, and we are. I'd rather be a woman in this country than any other. But look at 90% of the lowest paid jobs are all staffed by women. Look at the pay gap. Look at the salary gap. It's still here. So before we, pride ourselves, we should take our little spoon of humility here as well for how far we still have to go. But those can be ways in which you can bridge build and be able to do so in very natural ways, very functional ways.
I think she said it all. But the only thing I would add is that, especially in the Muslim community, it's very, very difficult. Being a female leader is a tremendous challenge, especially in this space where it's countering violent extremism, because it's not only controversial as a subject, but to be a female and a leader, it's a very, very delicate balance. I feel like I'm smiling a lot and apologizing a lot, and I use a lot of French feminism to just get myself out of angry situations. So I think maybe that's some of the characteristics that I think are valuable, is that women, maybe it's a little easier for us to be humble when we need to, and to maneuver ourselves out of difficult situations, and to be peacemakers between people that are angry or at each other's throats for one reason or another. Oftentimes we are able to bring them back to the table.
You want to add?
Yeah, I think you covered it in many ways, Maryann, because I'm thinking about my experience in Jordan, where I wasn't going to the hookah bars all the time to hang out with guys, but I was going to the all-female section of the gym, and that's its own space where women are building relationships and friendships. So yeah, I wasn't playing chess or things at the coffee shop, but that didn't, just because those relationships weren't being formed in a public way, didn't mean that they weren't authentic and important. And I also think that being a young white female is a strange asset in trying to convince more Catholics to get involved in interreligious dialogue, particularly with Muslims, because they find out that, oh, you lived in Jordan and you're white and you're Christian and you're a woman and you were treated well. So I think I helped to break down some stereotypes. These are not factors that I can control, but they help to break down people's stereotypes about Muslims, and so I use it to my advantage when I can. Yeah.
What was it like to be named Jordan in Jordan?
It made I had to learn to fake laugh really well, because people would crack
like
up.
You just did.
Yeah, yeah. No, because every time I would introduce myself, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, that's so funny! Your name's Jordan. It's like our country." I'm like, yes, I know. but it was cool.
You do it very well.
Thank you.
As an old white male, I'll take a stab at it. It's great to have people you work with who are young white females. I think Angela, who had the lion's share to do with this gathering, I think she just has a different filter than the rest of us. When you put together public policy in the Catholic Church, you don't end up with a lot of token guys and 3 women, and it's probably a shame. Any more questions? Here, and then back there.
Again, panelists and Dr. Carr, thank you for your time. I'm curious about, this is going to segue on several points that several of you have made. I spent a lot of time in undergrad in the Middle East, both studying and conducting private research, and just taken aback by my full experience, wanted to come back and share that with my university and the broader community. Well, I attended an HBCU. For those that aren't familiar, it's an historically black college and university in North Carolina, and I thought, in some sense, Jordan, I thought that because the students would be allowed to see me sort of as one of them in some respects, that they would be able to relate to me and then be able to understand and sort of take in the experience that I had. But unfortunately, I met a lot of adversity in that respect, and wasn't able to build those bridges like I wanted to. And I had to understand, I think, at some point that because of the church and its position, particularly the Protestant church and its position within the Black American community, socially, culturally, politically, that there may be some resistance in that respect. But being baptized Catholic and sort of raised non-identifying Christian, if you will, I thought that I could have that would have been my value proposition, to being able to make those inroads between both our students on campus and the broader Muslim community in the broader community. And so any insights or perspective that you could impart on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, are you saying that they didn't accept it because you were not Protestant?
I think, yes, that, but also just because it's completely, to the point that you made earlier, very unfamiliar to them, particularly in the South. And there's an overwhelming element of commitment to the Protestant church, I think, in the South, in North Carolina, and at my university in particular. And I think because of past social, cultural, political roots, and I use that in trying to use myself as sort of that between the two, but I love that person. That makes sense.
Yeah. And you're saying, like, what would have been a solution to it, or why did it happen?
That, but just, yeah.
Let me broaden it. What does class and ethnicity and race do to these relationships? We're at a whole part of the Trump appeal is to folks who've been left behind, to white working class folks. I mean, that's a very broad thing, but as we're building relationships, are folks who feel discrimination less open to the fact that others may be experiencing discrimination, or more willing to make common cause? People have been left behind economically, feel more vulnerable. I mean, I would assume both the LGBT community and the Latino community feel particularly aggrieved by what happened a week ago. In America, the diversity is our blessing, but it also complicates everything.
Well, I'll just say that, let me make sure I got what you were saying correct, that folks at your school were less open to Muslim-Christian relations. That was your perception when you came back? You're not alone? Yeah.
Compared to other university campuses that I visit, whether they're here in the States or in the Middle East. And I think some of that because it's really from a very personal space with the church. It's so really deeply aligned to the Black experience and the Black narrative in this country. It's, to your point, it's something that's so very unfamiliar. Straying away from that, and I think was a bit unsettling.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, I think that you're not alone and your school wasn't alone, because yes, I think Georgetown is a great, welcoming, open community that's dedicated to interreligious dialogue, but I think more broadly, Catholics themselves are still really hesitant to engage with Muslims. And I think, John, your point gets at it a little bit, which is that people do feel under attack in certain ways. And in a lot of Catholic circles, Christian persecution by Muslims is like all they ever talk about. So it's like, of course you're not going to want to talk to Muslims as human beings if this is what you're consuming all the time. And I've been really, myself, kind of disturbed really by the level of anti-Muslim rhetoric that exists in some Catholic circles too. So I don't think any of our Christian denominations is immune from this, unfortunately. So
I do think, though, that students in universities have a real ability to be those kind of cultural ambassadors. And it goes to a point raised previously about generational ambassadors. You know, at Catholic universities, they used to be, you know, mixing bowls between the Irish, Germans, Slovaks, and Poles. You know, that was the ethnic or cultural mixing that went on. And that's not true today. You know, because of international patterns, because of immigration patterns, because of the U.S. universities being a magnet for folks to come to and study from around the world, and because many folks coming from Muslim countries and even Muslim heritage here in the United States do seek religious-based universities to have kind of a traditional setting for their children, kind of a safe setting. So we're seeing more mixing across those lines, even at Catholic universities, than there was a few decades ago. And I think our students are much more open to that. So they can be those types of cultural ambassadors that come from personal relationships. You know, my friend Sam, Hassam, you know, things like that can be very effective in rebutting these general narratives. And the other thing is just education, a both and. You know, the narrative of persecution is true. And, you know, there is violence, tremendous violence against Muslims. And those things are true at the same time. So by admitting the truth of Christian persecution, that is not giving up the gauntlet on the other. And I think that's what you have to be able to say. These things can be true at the same time.
Can I ask you? Were you trying to introduce them to African American Muslims?
Not,
or to other Muslims
not
at all?
Directly, just the idea.
Not directly, and it later I think that was something that I tried to do and entertain. Because the university is an HBCU and it's in the South. Not only at the student level, but even within the faculty and in the administration, there's this very deep-rooted thinking of if I step beyond the bounds here, step over the precipice to explore what this is, that's compromising in some respect my Christian beliefs. And perhaps it was my approach. I don't know. I came back from the Middle East and I was dressed in the khandora and the khatra completely, and I just sort of walked on campus and introduced this new image or this temporary image of myself, but what this was. And so, sure, I think some students were probably a bit surprised, for sure. And as I said, there was a lot of adversity that was directed towards me from students, faculty, and administration. But I thought them seeing me and seeing me coming from this experience, that would have been sort of a great segue into this new dialogue, and the dialogue that should continue at the university.
So I'd like to share with you an ongoing issue that I've identified in our country that is not just, we've experienced it in Montgomery County. We continue to experience it because, you know, I run a collective impact model, so we're all of community, and so we address violence and bigotry all together. But I experienced it also in our neighboring county, which is Prince George's, which is 67% African American. And what we're starting to realize is that, so we have an immigration issue, right? So it's a controversial topic in our country right now. So we have these like stratifications of brown people, basically. So there's African Americans who are Americans, and then there's Latinos who are immigrants, but been here, perception is that they've been here longer than Muslims. And then there's a bunch of brown people that are Muslims that are coming from Middle East and South Asia. And so even at the community, at the student level, the tension that exists between these sectors of colored folks is striking. So and add to that wait a minute, if I accept you, then do I give up a piece of what I've fought so hard for to you? Do I have to share this with you? And then add to that the conversion of African Americans to Islam. Really uncomfortable, especially in the Christian context. Like, I mean, we've got clients, and the mother's like, every time she gets mad, she says, "I'm going to flush your Quran down the toilet," and we're like, "Oh, you got to stop telling him that," like it's just, I mean, it's about faith and love and family. I mean, it's a really emotional. It's not just, can we make friends? It's about family and future and generations and progeny and things like that, and it just brings out these reactions in people that are strong, and I've been at this 3.5 years, and I haven't cracked that nut. So we have a lot of work to do. I mean, I go around to my friends. I have my Latino American gang intervention worker, who's a very prominent member, and I have my civil rights commissioner, who's African American. And I tell them, I'm like, I just don't understand why there's so much infighting between us. Like, why aren't we joining together to get the rights for all of us, so we're constantly philosophically discussing that, and I think that's a conversation that's going to continue until we're able to solve it.
I live in Prince George's County, and we need your help.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something Maryann said, which I think might be a good way to close. Did we get everybody who had a question? No, one more over here.
My name is Marissa, and I wanted to piggyback on the diversity-adversity conversation, because we've touched on it, but we haven't really dealt with the LGBTQ aspect of all of this as well, because I know that creates a lot of conflict for those of faith, of the variety of faiths, and that particular community. So is there any way that we can maybe bring that into the conversation?
I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
We had a big event on Monday. We had almost 300 people. And again, we are all of community, all of our mosques. We put out a call, and we asked everybody to co-sponsor. And everyone's like, okay, what's the responsibility? Free food, people, what does it take? And some of the imams called me. They're like, can you change the title? And can we just condemn violence? And I was like, no, we're not going to condemn violence only. We're going to show solidarity with the community, with the LGBTQ community. And they're like, oh, that's difficult. And so we didn't get as many of the mosques, but it was a beautiful event. Again, friend me on Facebook. I'd be happy to share it. You can look it up. But it was, everybody just talked about the love and the healing that was in the room. And in my opening remarks, I said, I'm so glad that we did this, because this is the first time I've ever done an event with an with the LGBTQ community, and it's our first relationship together, because getting the Muslim community to accept that we could be crazy conservative, and that has nothing to do with whether we respect another human being for whatever choices, lifestyle, whatever that may be. It has nothing to do with our personal faith, and so I know for the Muslim community we've got a long way to go, but I think out of every tragedy hopefully is a glimmer of hope, and I hope that that's what happens for the Muslim community, at least, that they learn to build a relationship that's mutually rewarding and respectful.
I'm glad you brought this up, because I wanted to talk about some of the responses to what happened in Orlando, both from the Catholic community and the Muslim community, because I think both groups realize, this is our moment to, as you said, despite whatever we might believe about a particular lifestyle, we need to be here with this community, and we need to name the community that we're standing in solidarity with. And I was really floored by some of the statements coming out of Muslim organizations and Muslim leaders across the world. Really, there's a website, I forget the URL, but it's a website that has a statement from Muslim leaders, and then there's a huge list of all the people that signed on. Not only condemning the attack, but also standing in solidarity with the Muslim community and saying, if we're going to fight against Islamophobia, we're also going to fight against homophobia and transphobia. And they used those words, and I was really thrilled. And I was also glad, just coming from the Catholic side of things, that Father James Martin called out the bishops and said, you didn't mention what community was targeted in your statements, condemning the Orlando attack. And after he did that, you saw other bishops coming out and saying, we stand with the LGBTQ community, rather than just kind of these vague
I
vague
love
statements.
Jim Martin. He's a colleague of mine, and he is right about so many things. It was not after Jim made the comment, but Archbishop Supich
he was the one
in
before
Chicago, but also others. And I was going to say, you say we have a long way to go. Well, we've really solved this in the Catholic community. It's going really well. One of the really, people say, the rituals and what we go through, somebody walked off the floor of the house because he didn't want to be a part of thoughts and prayers. I think thoughts and prayers and vigils of solidarity and identifying with others, as sad as it is, opens our hearts and our minds. And in tragedy, we can find ties of faith and humanity that make us better people. I want to, before I ask the closing question, and go back to something Maryann said, and it really reflects, I think, what we've heard all night. She said we can hold two ideas in our head simultaneously. The most important word in Catholic social teaching is and. Human life and dignity, responsibility and rights. And Christian persecution and hostility towards Muslims. The way I try and think about this is we should neither exaggerate nor minimize terrorism. We should neither exaggerate nor minimize Christian persecution. We should neither exaggerate nor minimize the ways in which our faith has fallen short of what we believe. And tonight, I think we've had a great example of reality, of passion, of experience. And I'd like to close with a final question, going back to the title, Faith, Hope, and Courage in a Time of Fear. Where do you find your faith, your hope, your courage for the remarkable work you do? And let's start with Jordan.
Well, I've been really heartened by Catholics starting to really speak out and stand up about Islamophobia. And I think this event is one example of what needs to be happening more and more, coming out of Catholic institutions and churches. I had kind of lamented for a while that all the Christian groups that I saw that were releasing statements about anti-Muslim prejudice and discrimination or holding events were not from my faith community. And we're starting to see that change. Just a couple weeks ago, a number of Catholic advocacy groups released this really important statement on Islamophobia. I think some representatives from those organizations are probably here. You have Ignatian Solidarity Network, Franciscan Action Network, Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. Those sorts of things really give me a lot of hope in allowing Catholics to do that both and thing, to say, yes, there is a reality of Christian persecution, but that doesn't have anything to do with how we respond and the strength with which we respond to Islamophobia here in this country. And so that's just one example of where I find hope in my work on Islamophobia in the Catholic community.
Maryann?
I was privileged to spend time, as I said, this spring with some of the folks who had fled the ISIS violence from the Nineveh Plains. And if people who've they've lost everything, experienced horrific violence, can be hopeful about the future. And in terms of both and, they're teaching Aramaic, which is the ancient language of Jesus and the language of Christians who lived on the Nineveh Plains, and they're teaching Arabic to their family, to their children, because they want them to be able to live in integration with their Muslim neighbors. If they can be imagining that future and building that future in a war zone and saying, it's not going to come now, but they're taking that long-term view, then who are we in a country of peace and prosperity to naysay that? I think we have one place to be, and that is have their backs, with prayers and thoughts and every other action we can do to try to build those bridges and build that peace in our communities.
I belong to a religious tradition within Islam that has a very disciplined spiritual practice. So it is a way in which I connect through various saints that have existed throughout Islamic history and in modern times back to the Prophet Muhammad. So it is in reflection of that, of what they've taught me and what I've learned, and just the spiritual rejuvenation, because to tell you the truth, without it, I wouldn't survive. Because if I just look at what the world shows me, it'd be very, very difficult to do what I've done for so long. So I rely first and foremost on that spiritual practice.
When I woke up and saw the carnage in Orlando, it brought me back 15 years ago to Ground Zero and 9/11, and I was a part of a group that made a pilgrimage to Ground Zero, and it was shortly after the attacks. And it was an overwhelming emotional, spiritual experience. Fires were still burning, smoke was still rising. A couple times, everything stopped while they brought out pieces of people. And I was there with a group of priests, and one of the priests grabbed me, and he said, at that time I worked for the Bishops' Conference, and he said, "John, the work you're doing is more important than ever." He says, "The only way we're going to overcome this hate, this horror, is by what we were talking about last night, solidarity. We're one human family, building bridges instead of walls, respect for human life and dignity." He said, "The work you're doing is more important than ever." And I, of course, turned to him and said, "Father, the work you do every day in your parish, building up the community." And today this evening I'm struck by these remarkable women that at a tough time for our country, tough time for Muslims, for LGBT, tough time for all of us, tough time for parents trying to raise kids in all these communities, the work these people are doing is more important than ever, and the work we can do is more important than ever to build bridges, to stand up for the life and dignity of all. So join me in thanking these remarkable women.